Today we meet in Tantanya, Adelaide, on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and we extend our respects to Kaurna elders past and present. We recognise this country's rich traditions of knowledge and storytelling and pay respects to all Kaurna storytellers and all Aboriginal and First Nations storytellers. Welcome back to Amy and I'm Amy Matthews, and this is Pride Month. We're thrilled to have week 2 of Pride Month. I'm here, woohoo! I'm here with Justina Ashman.
Hi.
Payton Hogan.
Hello.
And Millie Heffernan.
That's me.
So last week, accidentally, I don't think we planned this, it's just the way, obviously, our brains work, but we ended up talking a lot about queer romance. I don't know that I planned to do that.
Discussion.
Yeah, worthy. But we thought we'd broaden it out this week to talking like more broadly about bookish culture and queerness, and because it feels like queerness actually was baked in from the beginning of literature. Do you know, in Western
That's
literature?
True. Yeah.
So what was your first experience? Like, did you, at university, did you study any like classics or anything that were, because I know that actually when I look back at my English 1 experience, there were actually a lot of books that were written by queer people or featured queer people.
Well, I was going to say The Importance of Being Earnest, I read, I think it was in my first year, which is not queer except for all of the ways that it actually is. Extremely queer. So that might have been the first like classic I read that was queer.
I think Mrs. Dalloway was the first classic I read where I was like, oh, like on the page you're thinking, that's a bit gay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But apart from that, we really didn't have anything. I feel like in uni you're not incidentally reading queer things. You're reading queer things when they're set to be read.
Like it's Queer Week. We're going to do the
Yeah.
queer author this week.
Yeah. I think I
But-
read Picture of Dorian Gray.
Oh, that's a good one. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wasn't that being adapted and they made them like uncle and nephew?
Cousins.
I
or
know,
something?
that's so
Cousins.
funny. I was like,
So weird.
gosh.
Yeah. What an interesting change
Choice.
to
Yeah.
make.
Yeah.
What an interesting thing to say about 2 queer men.
Also when people
so
talk about
obvious.
like reading comprehension degrading, I was like, well,
There it is.
it's like
Certainly someone can't read, probably.
Yeah.
it's like the they were cousins version of Troy with Achilles and Patroclus. Because God forbid Brad Pitt be gay.
God forbid. He's too manly to be gay. I was going to say, I feel like I did a lot of queer readings myself in university. There are a lot of things where a reading was set and I'd be like, well, I'm going to read this in a queer way because rah, 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 rah. So there was a lot
As you
of that in uni and then in college and high school as well. And I think a lot of people think you're doing queer readings of things like Dorian Gray and Mrs. Dalloway, and they don't realize that they
are queer.
actually
Yes.
in the book canonically, to use a term, queer books.
Yeah, I found that teaching Mrs. Dalloway, it was always astonishing to me that, I mean, it's not astonishing, is it? But that people are blind to it, that they
Yeah.
don't even see it there. Because the whole point of the book, like the bit with Clarissa, you know, she's thinking back to these big moments of her youth and they focus on like Peter or the men, but actually Sally is the big moment in her life. Like they talk about the kiss and it being like, I think rubbing her face on a rough wall, or like there's like a whole like this is an astonishment and a revelation that she kisses Sally, and it is the best moment of her life.
Yes, and her life with her husband is muted in comparison.
And he's repulsed by the female body, so he is also not a straight character.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think you could read it either way. I know a lot of straight men who I think don't like women. So
You say
true.
there's, you know, some straight men misogyny too hard. They misogyny too close to the sun and become gay.
They burn up.
I think maybe we'll have to cut this out. I think the most homophobic men you know are all gay. Their
I think-
behavior is so
can I
sexualized.
not to disagree with you, because it's always funny to say that, But I think on a serious note, I think it's very reductive to say stuff like that.
I do agree.
I think a lot of people make jokes like that, like, oh, Republicans hate gay people so much because they're secretly gay. And I think probably there are statistically some who are closeted, but I think I was watching an interview with Ash Perez, who is one of the Try Guys, weirdly. It's a serious interview because he's trans and he's transitioned in the last couple of years. And one of the questions is, why do you think conservatives hate trans people so much? And he makes the joke of like, I think it's because they're all secretly trans. But on a serious note, I think it's because what happens is conservatives see queer people deal with gender in a very free way, and it makes them angry at the ways that gender has boxed them in.
Yeah.
And so it might not be necessarily that they're gay or trans or whatever, but they see queer people living a life that they enjoy and they feel free in, and that makes them very angry.
Yeah.
I think also we forget about, sorry to cut you off, Justina.
Oh, no, I was going to say I do agree with you there. And, you know, it is good to call us in when we get too silly. But but I also think, yeah, it's that idea that, like, queerness being outside of what is considered, like, safe and normal, like, in terms of gender and sexuality for, like, more conservative understandings of those things is seen as really threatening.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think there's a lot of fear in it. There's an awful amount of fear in if you have a paradigm that is really set and someone challenges it, there's the total fear that the whole paradigm falls apart.
Yes, because if you see someone poking a hole in the illusion, then you're kind of like, well, why do you get to live that way when I've been living my whole life this way? Rather than taking it as like, well, this is an opportunity for you to take the permission to live more freely.
And it's this
They
fear
double
that
down.
you throw everything out. If you open one thing up to challenge, does that mean everything falls apart, right?
Yeah.
It's worth talking about how, when we're talking about books, that the like ability to publish in, like, traditionally publish in a mainstream arena explicitly queer books is actually quite recent in Western publishing, at least. And, like, you know, you were talking about Mrs. Dalloway and how some people like don't pick up on it, but I'm like, yeah, these books are coded queer for a reason, because they couldn't be explicitly queer.
I was going to say, you know, reading the classics and being like, oh, this is a little bit gay, or doing queer readings of things as a kid. My greatest wish as a kid was to read not like books about being queer necessarily, although it's obviously great that we can have those now as well. I just wanted to read books that had queer people in them. I love fantasy, I love sci-fi. I just wanted to read genre books that had queer people doing normal sci-fi, normal fantasy things, as opposed to a book about suffering and being queer and coming out. And there's room for all of those stories, 100%. But why can't we also have gay elves and trans aliens and asexual starship captains and that sort of thing?
That makes me think of Becky Chambers, who was so poorly recommended to me by the general online space when I first picked up her Long Way to a Small Angry Planet, because everyone's like, oh, it's like a lesbian space romp. And I read it, and it was a like ensemble slice of life, like spaceship crew that is like very queer, but it's not super romantic. Like the romance subplots that are in it are not even major subplots, I would say. But I think Becky Chambers writes really queer books that like, and just embeds it in the world and embeds it in just the people who are existing.
My favorite thing is picking up a book because I liked the look of it or the sound of it. Like there was this fantasy series I picked up a couple of years ago just because I saw it at the library, and I was just reading it, and then there was a queer person in it, like there was a trans woman in it, and I went, oh my God, I didn't expect this. I didn't pick this book up because I knew there would be a queer person in it. It just happened to be a queer person in this fantasy series, and that's my favorite thing, is being just surprised by it, as opposed to you still a little bit have to Google like sci-fi books with lesbians in them. Whereas just picking up a book and being like, oh my God, there's a lesbian in this.
So that's interesting, because we obviously gravitated in the first week of the month towards queer romance, and I'm guessing it's partly because we define, you know, queerness by sexuality, right? And the relationship to intimacy and to romance. And so what you're suggesting here is that actually we need to broaden out beyond that and think of the whole person, right?
100%. I mean, you can still, you can have romance books that have trans characters or ace characters or intersex characters. I was actually thinking about this in the car on the way here. I was like, you can't really write a romance book with a aromantic character. You could write a book where you could write a smut book with an aromantic character, but then because there's no romance in it, it's not a romance book. So where would you put a book like that?
But that's where now I think that there's a really interesting opportunity there for an author to expand what we think of as a romance novel or as the romance plot from an aromantic perspective, because there are, stories, I don't know about specific books, but people's lived experiences where they have very romantic friendships. They have lifelong platonic partners, but it is not a romance in the sense of I don't know, in the straight sense, I guess,
typical,
of a romance.
I believe
but
it's allo.
Yeah.
Romantic is the term.
Yeah.
Cancel me.
Yeah. So then are we? So that's broadening out love, right?
Yeah.
That there's romance, sex, and then there's love.
Yeah. And I was like, I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, could you write a romance book I'm
A
talking
love
the
story?
rules of romance with an aromantic character who does not fall in love, he wasn't fixed.
I wonder if
and
that
doesn't
book
fall in love by the end.
I wonder if that book already exists somewhere. And if it does,
Get in
and
the
you've read
comments.
it, let us know.
You're kind of giving me ideas on how it would work. Maybe, I don't know why my mind though, actually, no, I actually think this wouldn't work. Because my mind went to a polyamorous relationship where maybe an aromantic character witnesses the two people they love falling in love, but they're all in a I don't know. But then it's still about those two people's story primarily.
Yeah, if you could center it just on an aromantic character and their friend, could they still have a black moment? Could they still have a happily ever after, even though they're not romantically in love?
I think you definitely could. And I mean, my PhD research is all interested in how we can kind of explode the structures of romance with queerness. So I think that's actually a super exciting book that if someone hasn't already written it, they definitely should.
Yeah.
We have pivoted back to romance.
Well, it's a nasty habit of us.
But we're talking about how to be subversive. So it's fine.
Yeah.
I think the kinds of stories you were talking about before where the characters just happen to be there, that's always particularly refreshing. It's kind of refreshing considering our current context where we live, post-medicalizing homosexuality and the influx of all of these categorizations of queer behaviors. And I feel I don't know if anyone else can understand this experience, but you know how it feels like you're never able to have a pure sensory experience. You're having to filter everything through all of the language that there's a filter in your brain, and it sort of means you're imbuing every single sensory experience with meaning, even if it's a bit of a reach. You're never able to just experience something as it is without kind of neurotically overthinking it. But maybe I'm just neurotic and that's what I do.
I think there are probably people in the world who don't do that, but I think that, I think that's really relatable, definitely.
Yeah, good.
100%. Maybe it's just us. I don't know.
I feel like that's super
But it is,
relatable,
it's,
neurodivergent content.
Yeah, but it's also your context, right? And that your different anxieties and the things that you're filtering through are always going to be based on your context. And so for me, as a queer person, I am always filtering things through that part of my brain, because even though I'm surrounded by very loving and very accepting and very leftist people, I am reminded constantly that the rest of the world isn't necessarily like that. And so you do have to filter your experiences through that. And then you're going to do that depending on all kinds of your contexts, whether you're disabled or whether you're white or black or brown or, young, old, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
I think that specificity of context is something that I am really drawn to in fiction, because I find that sometimes I get frustrated with conversations about queer representation or just representation in general in fiction, because there seems to be an impulse to use it to generalize, to think, oh, how is this representing this entire group or community of people, when it can't do that. And in fact, I think writing is a lot stronger, more engaging, and just like more fascinating to read when it isn't trying to do that, when it is being so specific and so contextual of this one character's life or experience.
100%. And we're always, I feel like are always looking for the perfect representation when that doesn't exist, because no two queer people are exactly the same. And so no two queer characters should be exactly the same. Therefore, you can't represent the perfect queer character. And I think, as always, the answer to that is just more books, more movies, more TV shows. You know, I'm a huge believer in own voices books, but I also believe that the last decade has shown us that we can't police that the way that we think we can, because you just never know. Like, an author could be closeted, not ready to come out, you know, or might not have the kind of label that matches the characters that they've written in a book. And people get really uppity about that. You know, I just think the answer is just more of it.
Yeah.
I also think not to be like everything is Jack Halberstam's Queer Art of Failure.
Except that it is.
Book wreck, Queer Art of Failure. But like, yeah, that impulse to try and be like, oh, let's get the perfect one. I was like, but what is perfect? Who is telling you what is the perfect representation? How are you judging that? And what ideologies are hidden in that idea of perfect representation?
Yeah. And perfect is a, is a whip used against people. It stops us and silences us. So if you can't say it perfectly, don't say it. And then no one's saying anything.
Yeah. That's a real intolerance issue on the left that I've been having a huge issue with lately as well. There's no toleration for discomfort or ambiguity or imperfect people. And then your reaction to those people who are making mistakes or figuring things out will alienate them and just push them further away from your cause. Like, I just don't see the sense in it.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing at the moment, especially in young people on the internet, is that they are more concerned with saying the right thing than doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And that leads to that, we've got this whole cancel culture and all that sort of stuff, where, you can't just sort of make a mistake and then do better.
Yes.
Make a mistake and then that's it. It's a thing on your record for the rest of your life, especially because everything stays on the internet forever.
Yeah. I think one of the real strengths and real joys of fiction and of writing is the way that it can open us up to be really empathetic to perspectives and experiences outside of ourselves. So it's really frustrating to see people engage with books in a really combative way instead of with empathy. Which is not to say everybody does this.
No. But there is
and some
a
books,
lot.
as I enjoy being a hater as much as the next guy. So some books it's fun to be combative
But the thing
about.
is like hating with, it's social media, right? Because hating with your friends or sitting and having these conversations is so different than, because the author is not here. And there's something different about when you're online and you're atting people. And because, I was thinking as you were talking, all of you, about how we often say first draft thinking, even though we're recording it and putting it out. But that idea of first draft thinking also exists when you publish, that publishing is often seen as the final draft, but actually a lot of authors and theorists develop and their work. You will find a lot of theorists in literary theory who will release later work where they go, actually, forget everything I said in that article. I now think this.
Yes.
And I think there's something about, letting people develop and move on.
Well, I'm thinking about, I can't think of an example of someone who has corrected or built upon their own work, but I can think of theorists who kind of speak to each other, like Michel Foucault and then Judith Butler. And I feel like a lot of people in academia think that you have to follow one frame of thought, one theorist, when I don't understand where that's coming from. You're able to kind of take everything.
No, in fact, it feels almost insane to only follow one thread of thought. Like, what, you're going to be a Foucault clone?
Yeah.
Also, I think Judith Butler is a great example because they've continued to write about gender and they still continue to write about all sorts of things. But people, some people
Those
see
people, those
the
internet people.
When we say people, it's always
People.
People.
There's like a room somewhere with the people who have to go.
and they're angry about books and they're angry about
Shaking their
Butler.
fists. They're in that room.
But you know, you read like Gender Trouble and then you don't engage with the way those theories have developed and changed and evolved over time. And sometimes it's people's first engagement with queer theory at all, and they're like, "Oh, queer theory as a whole is not for me."
Yeah. I read a book. It's a really short book. It's sort of like a chat book because it's more so an essay that was just printed out by Barbara Ehrenreich, and there might have been a co-author, but it's called Witches, Nurses and Midwives. And in the foreword, they correct all of the information that had become outdated in the decades since they originally wrote it, because there were things like the statistics about how many women were killed in like witch trials were really high when they first wrote it, but the statistics are actually, people know that it's lower now. And people also know that it wasn't just women who were being targeted, things like that. So that was really interesting. And this is probably really irresponsible, but I don't usually read the forewords or the introductions of things. I often skip it. But thank God, I read it at the end of reading the rest of the book, and I was like, oh, okay.
I always read those things, always. I always find the introduction will give me so much context for reading that.
That's true. Yeah, sometimes you need it.
But fiction's different. Like, you do get authors who will, like, re-release something and update it. Like, we talked about Christina Lauren last month. But, yeah, I think we have a tendency to think of things as fixed, which they're not. And, like, you've all mentioned context. Like, I think as your context changes, everything changes.
And I think it speaks to what Millie was talking about before about how we can't police the idea of making sure that the author's identity is a perfect match for the characters they're writing, because you don't know what their experience is. And a lot of people do work through things that they're figuring out about themselves through writing fiction.
Yeah.
I think the rule of thumb is generally good. The idea that you should write about a diverse cast of characters. You shouldn't write the story of like a queer character if you're not queer yourself. Like, you wouldn't write a very queer-centric story if you weren't queer yourself. I think that's a good rule of thumb, but as always, you know, there's always exceptions to the rule. And we can't, you just can't always know what's going on behind the scenes. But also, it just would be so silly to say straight people can't ever write queer characters, because then you would just have books with only straight people and books with only queer people, and that's ridiculous.
Yeah. I think my like personal view about own voices narratives is that in some ways it's more a structural like industry issue rather than just being about individual authors. And I think when we're thinking about own voices stories, it's about platforming and platforming books by authors, own voices authors, and about, you know, what books get support, what books get attention online, things like that, rather than like, okay, let's now go through this list of books and make sure every single author is the correct identity.
Yeah.
Like,
yes. Let's list the acceptable books that you can read.
It's almost like it's a symptom of systemic inequalities rather than
Wild.
So weird.
individual. Yeah.
I saw this movie once, and it was a sapphic movie, and I realized a friend of mine had seen it as well, and I asked them what they thought, and they had nothing to say about the movie itself. They just said, I don't understand why a straight woman is making a movie about this. I knew that the filmmaker, through the grapevine, I knew that the filmmaker was bisexual. Just wasn't something that she felt the need to advertise online, obviously. But she was married to a man and had a baby. But I messaged this friend. I didn't out the person, but I was like, well, you don't know if that's true, do you? And she was like, she's married and has a baby. I was like,
I know, it's really funny how, because I think that happens a lot to bisexuals.
Yeah.
Like that if they happen to hook up in a heterosexual relationship and have a child, that it's like it cancels everything else. Like,
Yeah.
sorry, you've had a penis, it's done now.
Yeah.
Like, that's it.
The gig's up.
there is like an inherent misogyny to the way that some people, again, these are the people in the room who we don't like.
Yeah.
Anyway, in the way that some people conceive of sexuality and of queerness as like, there's the like, I mean, it's that common like idea that like, oh, bisexual men, everyone thinks they're actually just secretly gay, and bisexual women, people think they're actually secretly straight.
Yeah,
and either way, it's just
it's
that
the penis every time.
The fact that we still have, the fact that the term gold star lesbian still floats around
so
makes
gross.
me
Yeah.
so angry.
Yeah.
Because it's like, first of all, it's none of your business.
Yeah.
Second of all, some trans
like-
women have penises. Third of all, fuck off.
But also, like, how is that different to the like far right incel misogynists who are like obsessed with body count, who are obsessed with like,
Yeah.
How is that any different than being obsessed with whether a woman is a virgin or not when she
Yeah.
gets married? Like,
I was
Yeah.
like, it still comes down to like a really misogynistic, cisnormative, heteronormative policing of people's bodies.
Yeah.
of stuff that is just not your business.
Yeah.
This is why this stuff that I was talking about before, where I was like, I don't know if anyone can relate to this, but feeling like you're filtering everything through a computer or something and you can't just experience life or practice life. The filter or the computer is being built by both sides in a way. So you have these like intolerant people in the LGBTQIA plus community who still somehow don't understand the idea of fluidity and
Messiness.
messiness. And so then, yeah, like you're filtering everything through that computer, and I don't know how to finish the thought.
Well, I have a thought listening to you, which is that connecting your thought with Justina's thought is that because the systems are so big, right, and the systemic oppressions and weirdnesses are so fixed, it's so much easier to kind of go down to this granular level and get angry, like to get in that room and shake your fist and get angry at other individuals
Yeah.
rather than thinking about the system. Because if we all had systemic equality, wouldn't be such a big deal, would it? Like we wouldn't,
No.
you wouldn't necessarily, hopefully, care what people were doing in their bedroom or with their bodies.
That is
But I think
true.
it is
I've been-
particularly heartbreaking when it comes from within your own community, and other, minorities communities can speak to that on their own. But within the queer community, I find it particularly frustrating and heartbreaking, especially because this whole idea of being queer is that idea of messiness and freedom, and kind of, aren't we supposed to be breaking away from the mold to sort of be who we want to be and be how we really feel and all that sort of stuff. I don't think I've said it on this podcast, but I have said it around the table. It's that feeling of there are people who are gay and they kind of forgot to be queer. And that's okay. You don't have to be queer. You can just be gay. But I find there is a difference.
Yeah.
It's a great line, actually, because you do have very conservative gay people.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. And, TERFs is a great example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think any gay person who is a transphobe is the enemy, basically.
Yeah.
I cannot fathom it.
It makes me
Cannot
really,
understand.
really sad, all of it.
Well, this is what I feel like. I mean, one of the reasons that I like queer as a community label or personal label is because to me it is both like a flexible and fluid word, but also an inherently political one. And I feel like, it is, if you're not in solidarity with trans people, if you're not in solidarity with people who are suffering under like colonialism and other kinds of intersecting forms of marginalization and violence, like the queer movement came from really political queers.
Yeah,
Like-
100%. I agree. I find I use queer as a label with other queer people. And then out in the wider straight world, I use lesbian. I feel like I identify as a lesbian politically, not necessarily sexually. because people are really bothered by the word lesbian. So I do like to use it out in the world to be like,
Yes.
oh, lesbians?
Isn't that funny?
Lesbians.
Isn't that
Spite is
funny
a good
that-
reason to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I prefer the term queer, like you said, because it just encapsulates like fluidity and that messiness, and you don't have to kind of pin anything down, but also politically, I like the term queer, and academically as well. Sorry, Amy, you were going to say something.
No, I was just saying it's so funny how gendered that is, the reaction to lesbian particularly.
Yes. People really don't like it, and I feel that it makes people uncomfortable. So I like to say it as much as possible.
I feel like there are men in my life who are very misogynistic, everything else. And whenever I'm talking about anything political, even just remotely, their response will be like, "Oh, you're going to become a pink-haired lesbian now." I'm like, "What are you talking about? This
And
is
what if
so
the answer
weird."
is yes?
Yeah.
Actually, I'm going to claim that. What if it is yes? So what?
It's like, A, you're not insulting me.
Yeah.
B, what?
This
You've
is
just
like
listed some traits.
Yeah.
this is like the kind of conservative argument against like, you know, representation where people try to invent like the craziest combination of identities. So like, oh, what if you're like a queer, like disabled Muslim? I was like, you were describing real people who
Yeah.
exist.
Yeah.
I was like, you were trying to be like,
That's
gotcha. I was like, no.
Yeah.
The point is that people have these actual real experiences.
Yeah, you have just described a real person to me.
Yeah.
So
And yes, I would love to read their book.
if we want to bring it back to books
Yeah. On this bookish podcast.
on this bookish podcast, so I mean, I think we talked a lot about romance, and partly because the identity thing is so obvious in romance.
But also, yeah, because romance is so split into its subgenres.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
so have you got any recs for us, like in romance, in crime, in fantasy, in
I
any
have
book
one
recs?
that I want to recommend.
Yes.
Which is Highway Bodies by Alison Evans, which is a YA like apocalypse like horror. Oh my god, sorry.
For those listening at home, I've got kittens, and one is about to climb on Justina.
So pointy.
She's also been enjoying sitting on the table she's not allowed to sit on, and no one's pulled her off it.
Yeah, so Highway Bodies by Alison Evans. It's a very queer apocalyptic YA novel with zombies, and I loved it. There's like an ensemble cast of characters. It's very, I love the way that it takes those tropes of like found family that you get in like some apocalypse narratives where people band together, and it feels very like parallel to stories of found family that you get through queer people's real lives. I don't know. It was just, a great book.
I have a bunch that I feel like if I say them all, what am I going to put on my monthly book rec?
It could also be the book
Stuff
rec.
like we always bring up Gideon the Ninth. That's a great one, and that also. I mean, I knew going in, people were like, read this, it's gay, but I was still I was like surprised. I was like, oh, this is great. This is such a good book. Every Heart a Doorway by, and I think it's Seanan Maguire.
We can pop the book up when we.
I will pop the book up. That's a book about a house that takes in children who have gone through portals in their childhood and then had to come back to the real world. So kind of like, when the Narnia kids come back. And there's a cast of queer characters in that. Iron Widow is one of my faves. She's bisexual in that. And that is basically, I believe the author describes it as Dragon Ball Z cross Pacific Rim.
That's
incredible. Great. I really loved that book. The Empress of Salt and, oh my God, I can't remember what the title is, but that's great because they're clerics. In the book, the clerics give up their gender when they become clerics. So the main character is by default non-binary. That's great. Harry will disagree with me, but I really enjoy the Captive Prince series.
We should do like
Face off.
a whole bonus episode that's like a debate about.
I was going to say we've been on the opposite, and we've on different queer eps this month. God, what else is there? I mean, there's just
so many.
Yeah.
ton. but I can't think
I
of
really
now.
love, I've realized most of the queer books that I've read are like that weird fiction. Like I loved Big Swiss by Jen Began and Milk Fed by Melissa Broder. That one's really weird. For a little while you start to worry that it's turning into like a feeding fetish thing, but it never quite crosses the line. So then you can relax a bit and just enjoy the story a bit more. But I really enjoyed that. Yeah, like lots about complicated cross sections of identities and cultures and things like that. That was really good. And my mind is blanking
Yeah,
for the rest of
that's
the
what I
time.
really enjoy though. Like you can be like, oh, this is a lesbian book, or this is a gay book, or this is a bisexual book. But what I really like is when books are just kind of like, here's a character, and here's a bunch of stuff
Yes.
about them that's weird, and that's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, I feel
And I
like
also really like. Sorry, you go first.
I was just
I
gonna
have a long
say,
thing to say.
like that weird fiction. There's such like cool stuff. Like I don't know, like yeah, read more queer weird fiction and
Yeah.
queer
Like,
horror.
Like, yeah,
and,
write more
like,
books about queer cannibals. Write the book and have it end in the feeding fetish. Let's see what
Yes,
happens.
Why
you know?
not?
I really like especially in fantasy books and sci-fi books sometimes, when they have queer characters, but they don't use terms like trans or non-binary. They have terms specific for like the fantasy world. I really like that because I feel like our terms and our labels are so intertwined with the context of our world.
Yeah.
Whereas
and
with
very
fantasy,
Western
there's a
and-
really interesting opportunity to come up with different concepts for those labels.
I agree. And I actually sometimes find like I understand that desire to see like characters using the words that you use to talk about the way that they feel when they feel the way you feel.
Yeah.
But especially in fantasy, I find it really breaks me out of the world when
Yeah.
they're using terminology that is so specific to our world and the way our history and our context has moved.
And I guess fantasy and sci-fi and other kind of genres that aren't focused on the here and now, you have an opportunity to imagine different systems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And not
Yeah.
that they all have to be,
Utopic.
worlds where, just worlds where like it's okay to be queer. I think that's great. And there's lots of fantasy books like that. But you can also have like fantasy worlds where some people have problems with it. And then you can deal with that in a fantastical way as opposed to in a very depressing real world way. I'm saying you can have both. Like there should be room to have both of
Yeah.
those things.
I mean, it's funny how you scratch the surface and there's so many books actually.
Yeah.
Like, and I think what you said earlier, Millie, about just more is so important. And especially for, like, I think there are certain groups of readers in that room, obviously, like shaking their fists, but not just them. Like, there are studies that show that, like, men and boys don't tend to read books written by women.
Yeah.
And so I think that is probably turbocharged when we think about different identities, that people often need to experience stories outside of their own experience for a while before they can let themselves imagine they are that character. Do you know,
I keep
like
worrying about the decrease in men reading fiction lately. They're all reading the business bro
Yeah.
books.
you can hear my
It's
cats
alarming.
like meowing in the background. Sorry, everyone.
I feel real bad about the room of people we disagree with now. I feel
I
like
know,
we need
they-
to let them out of the room.
They need to come into the fold.
Yeah.
The door is wide open. They
We're
refuse
happy
to
to,
go
we're
through it.
ready to talk.
These poor imagined people.
And I was like, I need to be more empathetic to them.
but I know that from my own experience, like things are invisible to you sometimes until people point them out.
100%. Yeah.
And then even once they're visible, they can feel like, oh, like I can read that book, but I'm not yet projecting myself into that experience. And then after you've read a few, you're like, okay, now I am. I'm actually in it. I'm not even thinking about it.
Yeah.
Like I think particularly people who may be from more conservative backgrounds, the reading is part of it, right? Like when you say
Yeah.
you're worried about young men not reading, partly it's because it's learning how to have theory of mind, how to step into someone else's shoes, how to see a range of experiences, and they're not frightening. They're just people.
Yeah. And it's like you should give yourself full permission to do that. Sometimes I worry that people read things and they like don't want to immerse themselves too heavily in another experience because it feels like they're overstepping or something.
Yeah.
But like you can do that. That's what imagination is.
Yeah.
You can this is like a vessel for pretending your life.
And you can
is
also cope
totally
with someone
different.
saying fuck off to you, right? Like if someone if you're reading a book where you're experiencing rage as well as, you know, we're saying come into the fold, but also it's okay if you're reading a book which is like fuck off, this is my space. You can learn.
Not everything is for you.
Yeah, you can cope with that. That's
Straight
okay.
up.
One of the things I love about reading is that immersion. And sometimes this is something I struggle with when we in the ways that we sometimes talk about romance, is that like I really don't ever see myself in the characters in the romance.
Yeah, I don't either. But self-inset's a real thing.
Yeah, but because I am so interested in that immersion into a different experience that
becoming a different person.
But do you think that's a reading practice that when you've grown up not seeing yourself, you learn, right? Because I think also you see that with gender.
Wait a second.
Hold on a minute. Wait, we're cracking this thing wide open.
Oh my God.
Because when I was young growing up, like if I watched action films, I would imagine I was the guy.
Yeah.
And so I'm okay picking up a book, imagining I'm the guy character, and I'm okay imagining other things. But I would think a lot of guys would struggle to watch a female protagonist and imagine they're the female.
Do you know what this reminds me of? There's an interview, a delightful interview with Jennifer Lawrence and Josh Hutcherson about the Hunger Games. And the interviewer asked Jennifer Lawrence if she imagined herself as Katniss when reading the books. And then Josh just goes, I did. And she goes, oh, you imagined me? He was like, no, I imagined me.
That is exactly what it is.
This is
that
amazing.
boy has theory of mind.
He does. He has read a lot of books. Yes. Anyway, I think we're out of time, but thank you for joining us and for putting up with my crazy cats. And that was, I think we could talk a lot more about this. So luckily we're
I can't believe we only get 1 month a year.
I can't believe
I just think we're not going to do that. I don't think we're going to do that though. I think we're going to try and integrate it.
Yeah. It's not just all packed into 1 month.
We need
that was a joke.
All the pride rainbows every month.
That was a joke.
Yes, we are joking. We are not being tokenized.
It's called humour. Humour.
The rest of the year we put them in that room and they can shake their fists.
I will say also every month is queer month when we have queers on the podcast. So.
That's true. Our book recs, my book recs are always queer, every single one of them.
So thanks for joining us. So next week we're really excited. We're going to be interviewing Patrick Lenton, whose new book, In Spite of You, is just everything we need right now. We've all been reading it and it's like you open it and you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then the week after we will have our book club. So if you haven't picked up Melanie Seward's in what's it called again?
Love
my God,
Unleashed.
Love Unleashed. I was going to say In Spite of You. And I'm like, that's Patrick. Melanie Seward's Love Unleashed, which I actually loved so much. I messaged her like 2 chapters in because I got to the second chapter where she says goodbye to her stepdad and brother at the airport.
Yeah.
And I actually cried. And I was like, there's not many authors who can make me tear up that quickly.
Yeah.
The real question is it going to get Abby?
I don't know if Abby's ever cried at a book. We'll have to find out.
But it is a breath of fresh air, I will say, especially in today's political climate. It's just such a lovely book.
Yeah, I loved it. I really loved it. So grab your copy of Melanie Seward's Love Unleashed. And Patrick's book isn't out yet, but definitely do the pre-order for In Spite of You because it is just a corker of a book. I loved it from the first page. So yeah, thanks. Happy Pride Month, everyone.
Happy Pride Month. Bye.
Bye.